Harriet Jacobs was born enslaved in North Carolina in 1813, into a world that had already decided her fate before she could speak her first words. Yet, strangely, her earliest years did not feel like a prison. As a child, she knew warmth, family, and a fragile sense of safety. She was surrounded by parents who loved her deeply, a grandmother whose strength shaped her spirit, and a household that, for a brief moment, allowed her to believe that life could be gentle even in chains. But that illusion did not last. One by one, the pillars holding up Harriet's childhood collapsed. The death of her mother was the first crack, quiet but devastating. Then came the loss that truly shattered her sense of security, the passing of the mistress who had shown her kindness and taught her to read. In a single moment, Harriet learned a truth that would define her life. Kindness could vanish, but ownership remained. She was not a child in the eyes of the law. She was property. What followed was not just a change of household, but a violent awakening to the reality of slavery, one where power had no limits, and protection could disappear overnight. Harriet's story is not only about suffering, it is about awareness. It is about the moment a young girl realizes that survival will require courage far beyond her years. This is the beginning of a journey that will test the human spirit in unimaginable ways, a journey of sacrifice, endurance, and quiet resistance, a story of a woman who would choose confinement over submission, silence over surrender, and love over fear. If stories of courage hidden in the margins of history matter to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that stories like Harriet Jacobs are never forgotten. The fragile sense of safety Harriet once knew disappeared completely as she crossed the threshold into adolescence. The child who had believed herself protected now began to understand the true meaning of ownership, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily, suffocating reality. When she was sent to live in the household of Dr. James Norcom, the transition marked a turning point from quiet hardship into a relentless struggle for her inner life. The walls of that house closed in on her, and with them came a constant awareness that her future was no longer hers to shape. Dr. Norcom presented himself to the world as a respected physician, a man of education and standing. Yet behind closed doors, his authority ruled without restraint. As Harriet grew older, his attention toward her shifted in ways that filled her with unease long before she could fully understand why. What began as controlling behavior slowly transformed into something far more threatening, a presence that followed her through every corner of the house, every hour of the day. She learned to measure her steps, her words, even her expressions, knowing that a single moment of carelessness could bring consequences she had no power to resist. What made this period especially devastating was not only the behavior itself, but the complete absence of protection. There was no law she could appeal to, no authority willing to listen, no safe place within reach. Those who held power over her were the very ones who defined her silence. The household offered no refuge, only watchful eyes and unspoken threats. Even ordinary moments became sources of tension, as Harriet lived with the constant awareness that her thoughts and boundaries were invisible in a system that recognized only control. As the pressure mounted, Harriet's inner world became both her shelter and her battlefield. Fear followed her into sleep and greeted her each morning, yet beneath it grew a fierce determination to remain herself. She understood, with painful clarity, that survival required more than endurance. It demanded strategy. Every day was an exercise in restraint, calculation, and emotional endurance, as she fought to preserve her sense of dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Isolation deepened her struggle. Speaking openly was unthinkable, not because the truth lacked weight, but because revealing it could bring even greater harm. Trust was a risk, and silence became a form of protection. Harriet learned to carry her fear quietly. to endure without visible resistance, while inside she refused to surrender her identity. This quiet resistance, invisible to those around her, would later define the strength of her legacy. These years shaped Harriet in ways that would echo throughout her life. They taught her that freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the ability to claim ownership of one's own body, choices, and future. Though she was still young, the weight of constant threat forced her to mature quickly, sharpening her awareness and hardening her resolve. What she endured in Dr. Norcom's household did not break her spirit, but it transformed it, planting the seeds of decisions that would later astonish the world. This chapter of Harriet Jacobs' life is not merely a record of suffering. It is the moment her quiet endurance began to evolve into deliberate resistance. From within a system designed to silence her, she learned to think beyond it, to imagine escape not only as a physical act, but as a reclaiming of self. As the pressure within Dr. Norcom's household intensified, Harriet came to a painful understanding. Doing nothing was no longer a form of survival. The quiet strategies that had once allowed her to endure were no longer enough to shield her from a future being forced upon her. Every day, the sense of being watched, measured, and claimed weighed heavier on her spirit. Harriet realized that if she remained passive, her life would be shaped entirely by another's will, and the cost would be the last fragments of her self-respect. In this suffocating reality, Harriet faced choices that no young woman should ever have to consider. She did not live in a world that allowed her purity to be protected by law or compassion. Instead, she lived in a system where her body was seen as something to be commanded. Understanding this, Harriet made a decision rooted not in recklessness, but in defiance. If her future was going to be shaped by forces beyond her control, then she would seize the small, dangerous space where choice still existed and claim it for herself. Her decision to form a relationship of her own choosing was an act of resistance born from desperation. It was a way to deny her enslaver complete power over her life and identity, even as she remained physically trapped. This choice came at a profound emotional cost. Harriet wrestled with fear, doubt, and the weight of judgment, knowing that society would condemn her actions without understanding the prison she lived in. Yet she chose to bear that burden rather than surrender entirely to a fate imposed upon her. Motherhood followed, and with it came a love more powerful than anything Harriet had known. The birth of her children transformed her struggle into something deeper and more urgent. They became her reason for endurance, her source of strength, and the clearest reminder of what was at stake. Even as she held her children close, Harriet understood the cruel truth of their situation. They were bound by the same system that had bound her, vulnerable to the same forces she fought daily to resist. Living as a mother under constant threat sharpened Harriet's awareness of time and consequence. Every decision now carried weight, not only for herself, but for the small lives that depended on her. She measured each moment against the question that haunted her thoughts. How could she protect them in a world designed to deny their humanity? Love, once a private refuge, became a responsibility that demanded courage far beyond endurance. Rather than breaking her, this responsibility clarified Harriet's purpose. She no longer sought survival alone. She sought a future. The presence of her children transformed her resistance from an inner battle into a long-term vision, one that required patience, sacrifice, and an unshakable resolve. She began to see that protecting her dignity was inseparable from protecting theirs, and that any chance at freedom would have to account for all three lives, not just her own. These choices did not free Harriet from danger, nor did they offer immediate relief. Instead, they deepened the conflict surrounding her, tightening the forces that sought to control her. Yet they also strengthened her sense of self. In choosing love, responsibility, and defiance within the narrow limits imposed on her, Harriet reclaimed a measure of agency that the system had tried to erase. This chapter of her life stands not as a moment of defeat, but as a turning point, where endurance evolved into purpose and survival began to take the shape of resistance. The moment Harriet learned that her children could be taken from her, something within her hardened into resolve. Until then, she had endured fear, humiliation, and constant pressure with the hope that patience and careful resistance might allow her to survive without tearing her family apart. But the threat of separation changed everything. The danger was no longer abstract or distant. It stood directly in front of her, aimed at the two lives that had become the center of her world. In that moment, Harriet understood that staying meant surrendering her children's future, and surrender was something she could no longer accept. Escape, however, was not a simple act of running away. Harriet knew that leaving without a plan could place her children in even greater danger. If she vanished entirely, retaliation was almost certain. The system she lived under had countless ways to punish those who resisted, and children were often the first to suffer. Harriet's love forced her to think beyond herself, beyond the immediate relief of freedom, and toward a strategy that might protect her children, even if it meant enduring further suffering alone. In 1835, Harriet made a decision that defied every instinct of self-preservation. She left the house where she was held, stepping into uncertainty, but she did not flee far. Instead of heading north immediately, she chose to remain hidden nearby, close enough to watch over her children, yet invisible to those searching for her. This choice was an act of sacrifice rather than escape. Freedom, as she imagined it, would have to wait. Her priority was safety, not distance. Living as a fugitive so close to danger required constant vigilance. Harriet moved between temporary hiding places, relying on a small circle of trusted family members and allies who risked everything to protect her. Each night brought uncertainty, each sound a reminder of how easily discovery could undo everything. She existed in a state of suspension, neither captive nor free, her life narrowed to careful movements and quiet endurance. What sustained her through this period was the belief that her absence could change the balance of power. By removing herself from reach, Harriet hoped to exhaust the forces pursuing her and create conditions in which her children might be spared. It was a painful calculation, one that demanded emotional distance from the people she loved most. She could not hold her children, could not reassure them, could not explain why she had disappeared. Instead, she carried the burden of their confusion in silence, trusting that time and patience would serve them better than her presence ever could under threat. This form of resistance was invisible to the outside world, yet it demanded extraordinary strength. Harriet's sacrifice lay not only in hiding, but in choosing restraint over action, silence over explanation, and separation over immediate comfort. She accepted loneliness as the price of protection, believing that a mother's duty sometimes required absence rather than closeness. As days turned into months, Harriet's understanding of freedom evolved. It was no longer a single destination or moment, but a process shaped by difficult choices and delayed rewards. By staying hidden, she preserved the possibility of a future in which her children could grow without fear. Her decision redefined courage, showing that resistance did not always mean confrontation, and that survival could sometimes take the form of waiting. This chapter of Harriet's life reveals the depth of her devotion and the clarity of her purpose. She did not escape for herself alone. She vanished so her children might one day live openly. In choosing to remain nearby yet unseen, Harriet transformed her suffering into a shield, proving that even in confinement and uncertainty, a mother's resolve could reshape destiny. The choice to remain hidden eventually led Harriet into a place that was barely a room at all, a narrow attic crawlspace tucked beneath the roof of her grandmother's home. It was not a refuge meant for living, but it became the center of her world for nearly 7 years. Once inside, Harriet understood that this decision would demand a level of endurance she had never before imagined. The space was so low that she could neither stand nor sit upright, forcing her body into constant strain. Darkness wrapped around her, broken only by the faint sounds of life continuing below. Time inside the attic moved differently. Days and nights blurred together as Harriet learned to measure the passing hours by footsteps, voices, and the distant rhythms of the outside world. The heat of summer turned the space into an oven, pressing down on her lungs and draining her strength, while winter brought cold that crept through every crack in the roof. Illness became a constant threat, and rest was never complete. Yet she endured, knowing that discovery would mean not only her own suffering, but renewed danger for her children. The greatest hardship was not physical, but emotional. Harriet was close enough to hear her children laugh, cry, and call out, yet too far to answer them. Through a tiny opening she later carved into the wall, she watched them play, grow, and change, observing their lives as if from another world. Each glimpse brought both comfort and pain. Seeing them safe strengthened her resolve, but the distance cut deeply, reminding her of everything she was sacrificing. To her children, she was absent. To herself, she was always watching. Isolation tested Harriet's mind as much as confinement tested her body. Long stretches of silence forced her inward, where fear and hope wrestled constantly. Some days she felt strong, convinced that her sacrifice would one day be rewarded. Other days, despair crept in, whispering doubts about whether freedom would ever come. She learned to manage these inner battles quietly, drawing strength from memory, faith, and the simple act of endurance. Despite the harsh conditions, Harriet refused to let the attic reduce her to invisibility. She read, sewed, and reflected, using the limited light and space to preserve her sense of self. The crawlspace became both a prison and a place of transformation, where suffering sharpened her purpose rather than erasing it. Every hardship reinforced the reason she remained there, her children's future. Years passed slowly, marked by changing seasons and the gradual aging of her body. The confinement left lasting effects, weakening her health and limiting her movement. Yet even as her strength diminished, her resolve did not. Harriet understood that survival was not merely about staying alive, but about maintaining the belief that her sacrifice had meaning. Each day hidden was a day. Her children lived without immediate threat, and that knowledge sustained her through moments of doubt. This long chapter of silence and stillness shaped Harriet in profound ways. It stripped life down to its essentials, forcing her to confront fear, loneliness, and hope in their purest forms. The attic, small and suffocating, became the place where her resistance took its deepest root. By choosing endurance over surrender, Harriet transformed confinement into a form of power, proving that even in the narrowest spaces, the human spirit could refuse to yield. Freedom did not arrive for Harriet Jacobs all at once, nor did it erase the years she had lost. But when she finally reached the north, it marked the beginning of a new chapter defined by voice rather than silence. After years spent hiding, enduring, and watching life from the shadows, she was able to stand openly in a place where the law no longer defined her as property. Legal freedom gave her safety, but it also gave her something just as powerful, the chance to tell the truth of what she had lived through. Harriet understood that her story was not hers alone. It reflected the lives of countless women whose suffering was hidden behind closed doors and unspoken fears. Rather than leaving the past behind, she chose to confront it, carefully shaping her memories into words that could reach beyond her own life. In doing so, she transformed pain into purpose. Her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was not written to shock, but to reveal. It illuminated the human cost of slavery, especially the experiences of women, which were often ignored or dismissed. Publishing her story required courage. Speaking openly meant exposing wounds that society preferred to overlook. Yet Harriet believed that silence only protected injustice. By sharing her experiences with honesty and dignity, she challenged readers to see enslaved women not as symbols, but as human beings with thoughts, fears, and strength. Her words carried a quiet power, forcing the public to confront realities that could no longer be denied. Over time, Harriet's voice became part of a larger movement that pushed toward change. Her life showed that survival itself could be a form of resistance, and that truth, once spoken, could outlast chains and walls. She did not present herself as flawless or fearless. Instead, she wrote as someone who had endured and learned, offering her story as both testimony and warning. Through her work, suffering was no longer hidden in attics or whispers, but preserved in history, where it could educate and awaken future generations. Harriet Jacobs' legacy lives on, not only in the pages of her book, but in the courage it inspires. Her journey reminds us that even in the most confined circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to endure, resist, and ultimately speak. She turned years of silence into a lasting message that continues to resonate today, proving that truth, once released, has the power to shape history. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Harriet's story. If this journey moved you, or gave you a new perspective on history, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that deserve to be remembered and heard.